Okay, juniors, we'll get going here and discussing the remainder of the Vietnam War that we have yet to discuss. So, from our last lecture, we had left off with kind of talking about getting into the later 1960s and Lyndon Baines Johnson, his first full term as president, kind of some of the things that were going on, some of the public opinion factors, the morale of our army, and things that are overall just kind of going on here. And, that's kind of leading to some, I guess, more controversy associated with the Vietnam War. So that's where we had left off. So we'll go today, and where we'll start today is we'll start in 1968. Again, the year to me, for all intents and purposes, is not super important, but 1968 was a super important year as far as developments with the Vietnam conflict. And we'll kind of talk about the changing of the guard and the changing of the presidential administrations. But kind of leaving off where we had, we're picking up where we had left off. We had discussed that, again, the fighting in Vietnam was different than it had been for other wars. There was a lot of sneak attacks, guerrilla tactics used by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese to fight the United States and the South Vietnamese. And so going into 1968, January of, that is towards the end of the month is when the Vietnamese celebrate Tet. And their Tet is like New Year's. It's kind of their, big holiday. And there had been not an armistice, but like a ceasefire agreement that had kind of like an informal one saying, it's a holiday. We're not going to fight on the holiday. Okay, we're going to take a few days off from the war to celebrate Tet. And the United States, the South Vietnamese, didn't expect that there would be any military action during the Tet holiday, and so they were all kind of off guard. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong, obviously secretively and dressed as normal people, had brought in weapons because a part of the Tet is celebrating their dead, and they had brought in these weapons and bombs and whatever in these coffins. And so during this Tet holiday, the Viet Cong launched all kinds of these surprise attacks all across South Vietnam, and even an attack on a U.S. embassy in Saigon. So that was a part of this, and the United States and the South Vietnamese were simply not ready for it. Okay, and again, this is 1968. It will be Johnson's last year here as president of the United States. And as this goes on and things in Vietnam continue to happen, LBJ became less and less popular. In 1968, the Democrat Party actually, and this doesn't happen very often, but he's been the president. It's kind of like the highest ranking position a government officer can have in the United States. And his own party basically asked him not to run for re-election. The Democrat Party started exploring other options like Robert Kennedy, younger brother of John Kennedy, and a couple others. And he basically just says that he's not going to seek re-election, and kind of very down in the dumps. And he had become probably the most disliked person in the United States. And what happens here, again, kind of furthering, getting closer to the presidential election in 1968, is you start seeing a lot more college protests on college campuses all throughout the United States. This younger group of people, the New Left, as they were sometimes called, really became more politically involved. And these protests sometimes turned violent and not good and things like that. But important to understand that our college students at this point were one of the biggest or most outspoken groups of people regarding the United States involvement in the Vietnam War. The other event on here that you want to know about is in 1968, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. That is where the Democrat Party would nominate their new candidate for the 1968 presidential election. And in Chicago, a bunch of protesters showed up, and they actually protested at the convention, and there was riots in the streets, and the National Guard came in, and it was a really scary deal. And this was all got broadcasted on live TV, so you see these protesters that are being appearing to be attacked, and it became a very controversial matter. So understanding that in that Democrat National Convention of 1968. And what this does lead to is some of LBJ's unpopularity and such. As a Democrat, it leads to the resurgence of Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, who had ran for president and lost to Kennedy in 1960, had ran for governor of his home state of California and lost there, and was virtually out of politics. But then when he went back and started practicing law again, he kind of gained some political allies, and eventually he is able to win the Republican nomination for president And again, similar to like LBJ and presidents before, he's promising to end the war. That was a big part of his campaign. So in 1968, Richard Nixon of California will be elected president. And that kind of brings us into the end of the war and talking about what that's like. So Nixon, one of the things he starts doing along with his one of his key advisors, Henry Kissinger, is he begins to pull troops out of Vietnam, in pretty high numbers. However, as he's pulling troops out or ordering troops to return home from Vietnam, he is also continuing to wage war, with bombing raids and other things like that. So it's kind of a, you're saying want to end the war. You're taking troops, you're bringing troops home, which is great, but you're still fighting, right? So like, what are we doing? And so the plan that Nixon and this Kissinger, Henry Kissinger, that they developed, they call it Vietnamization. And they believed, or that was the process of, they were going to withdraw troops from Vietnam and kind of leave South Vietnam, on their own, with obviously with supply and maybe financial aid, to take control of the war effort. Because that was kind of the very popular public opinion that this was South Vietnam's war and that not the United States's. And so this process would basically allow the United States to become less involved with the actual physical fighting of the war, and would allow the South Vietnamese to, fight the North Vietnamese. And again, Vietnam War is still very unpopular, and Nixon claims to, to feel like he represents the silent majority, that there's a lot of people that actually think in Nixon's mind, the silent majority were people who supported the war effort, but did not say much about it. And he kind of said that these loud protesting college students were basically just the loudest voices in the room, and they did not actually reflect the true public opinion. Other things here, another big event that kind of makes, that again will further this distaste by the public for the Vietnam War, is in 1970, information comes out about what's called the My Lai Massacre. So the My Lai Massacre was a U.S. military operation in 1968, where there was a platoon that was, they were on patrol, and they were given orders by their commanding officer to kill anything that moved. And so they marched into one of these Vietnamese villages along like the Vietnam, North and South Vietnam border, the village of My Lai. And though they did not find any suspected Viet Cong members, what they did is they rounded up the 200 people that were in the village, mostly women and children, and they killed them. Like, shot them, killed them senselessly. Like, the platoon just fired shots, kind of got them into a crowd and just fired shots into the crowd and killed 200, women and children. And so that was something that it hadn't come out right when it happened, but when it did come out, there was a lot of outrage about it. And that's something that Nixon took a bad rap for, despite the fact that he may not have been president when that all happened. Also in 1970, we talk about college protests. Kent State in Ohio, there was an anti-war protest. The students there had, there had been some damage done to the ROTC building, which is kind of like the military office building on a college campus. And the National Guard came in to put an end to this, and it ended up killing four college students. So here are a couple of the well-known photos associated with the Kent State protests. Usually pictures that are kind of synonymous here with the Vietnam anti-war movement. And, very shortly after, you're going to see something similar to this happen at Jackson State in Mississippi. But two of the more well-known Vietnam protests that really took a bad turn. Other things here, again, and this did not help public opinion. Something else that didn't help public opinion is in 1970, the New York Times and the Washington Post, they received a huge document called the documents become known as the Pentagon Papers. And these were documents from 1966, 1967, 1968. And basically, and this was something, even like before LBJ's, or I guess during LBJ's first full term as president. And what it was is these papers kind of outlined the United States' military plan in Vietnam. And the message from LBJ, Nixon, and everybody always been like, we're trying to become less involved. Well, this Pentagon paper document basically said that the United States had no intention of ending or stopping their war effort until they had absolutely obliterated and ended any form of communism in Vietnam. So despite the fact that you had presidents LBJ saying, we want to get out of this and such, these Pentagon papers actually kind of said different. Now, again, these papers were first written in middle 1960s. In 1970, a guy who worked for the National Security Council leaked the classified documents to the newspapers, and the newspapers wanted to publish. They wanted to publish portions of these papers because, again, it was kind of like a government cover-up almost, right? Where the government's saying one thing but doing something else. And these New York Times, Washington Post, they wanted to publish these. Nixon tried to block it, saying that, this is classified information. Supreme Court steps in and actually says, hey, you know what? The government has wronged the people here. It is the job of the press to inform the people. And the New York Times and the Washington Post were allowed to publish some of those. There's actually Tom Hanks in a movie a few years back called The Post. It's real good about this. But Supreme Court case here to be aware of, United States versus the New York Times. Okay, getting closer to the end of the war. So Nixon's still in office. He's gonna win re-election in 1972, and eventually he'll resign with the Watergate scandal. But the bombing raids continue. The North-South, U.S., North Vietnam, South Vietnam, they signed a quote-unquote a peace agreement in 1972, which basically said, the North Vietnamese soldiers are going to allow to be, stay in South Vietnam, but they're not going to actually fight. And, nonetheless, the fighting still continues even after this peace agreement signed. In March of 1973, pretty much all of the U.S. troops have come home from Vietnam. And by 1975, they were all gone. But now in April of 1975, when the United States had pretty much left Vietnam altogether, the South Vietnamese city, the capital city of Saigon, the North Vietnamese had come in and they overran the city. And what eventually is going to happen as a result of all this is, Vietnam is still going to become a communist nation. Okay, no more North and South. It's just Vietnam, and it's all communist. As far as some legacy and impact, there's a lot that can be said here. I have some of the death totals in here. About 60,000 U.S. deaths. Even we had even more injuries and wounded people, or soldiers, I should say. Between the North and the South Vietnamese, about 2 million, and 2 million might be a low estimate, are going to die. As far as coming back from Vietnam, veterans, again, especially the Vietnam vets, they oftentimes got treated kind of poorly by certain members of the public for being in Vietnam and some of the controversy associated with that. But civilian life for some of the vets was really hard. A lot of them had developed maybe some forms of mental or physical illness. Post-traumatic stress was a big one. Some of them came back and had issues with drugs and alcohol, trying to cope with some of the things that they probably had to see or do in Vietnam. In 1981, the government's going to establish the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And here you see a picture of that in Washington, D.C. It has the names of all of the U.S. Soldiers who lost their lives. Very powerful thing. Hopefully next spring when we go on our close-up trip, we'll get to swing by this. I've heard it's a very powerful experience. Even after the Vietnam War, there's going to be more issues in Southeastern Asia, issues in Cambodia, civil wars. And then kind of the biggest one is really at this point, Vietnam War is when people became more cynical of about the government, basically questioning, the trustworthiness of the government. And a big part for that, big reason for that is the United States with this Vietnam War, there was a lot of instances here where the government tried to cover up something, or they weren't fully honest with the public about a portion of the war, the My Lai massacre, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. There's a couple of different examples there where the government might not have been forthcoming in sharing the information that they should have been sharing with the people. And so people, the United States public ultimately becomes a little bit more cynical, meaning kind of questioning what it is that the government's doing, and maybe a little finding the government to be a little less trustworthy than what it makes itself appear to be. As far as some important U.S. policies that are going to change as a result of the Vietnam War, we actually add a constitutional amendment after the war is over in the early 70s, and that's the 26th Amendment. And that is the federal voting age amendment at 18. There were a number of soldiers at this time who were sent to fight but never actually got to vote. And that was kind of a controversial thing, where they never got to express their political opinion because voting age had been a state issue. Some states it was 18, some was 19, some was 21 to vote. And so in the 1970s, when they changed that, and the 26th Amendment to the Constitution creates a federal voting age of 18, that was something to kind of, say, hey, if we are going to send you off to fight. You'd at least deserve the right to vote for who might do that, okay, or however. And then the other thing, and this is kind of a little more controversial, is Congress passes the War Powers Act in 1973. And what the War Powers Act does is it attempts to limit the military power of the president when there is an undeclared war. And now, again, we've fought undeclared wars since Vietnam. So the question has it actually really done anything? And the big thing with the War Powers Act is it is supposed to limit how long troops can be stationed somewhere in a foreign land without a declaration of war. But those were two important policy changes here as a result of the time period. It's the end of the chapter here, guys. So if you have any questions, please let me know.